Okay, I hope that that is visible to everybody. And great, well, it is a pleasure to be here meeting you all this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. It is Saturday evening here, so it is pitch black outside, and I hope we don't hear too many rowdy people walking past the window, but there is a possibility of that. But I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all a bit about the work that I do. As a conservator, specialising in the treatment of manuscripts, my interactions with objects are very much concerned with their physical characteristics and their material functionality. In order to ensure their preservation, I focus on their material characteristics and individual conservation needs for each item, so it's very much a bespoke approach. This perspective offers an intimate view of the workings of the book. I'm frequently faced with a view last seen by the book's binder as he tied down the final thread of an end band or adhered the leather covering to multi-layered pasteboards. The conservator works from the outside in, starting with a wide general overview and working down to the minutiae of both materials and techniques. Practically, this means we start by looking at the macro, the whole object and its context, before working down to a microscopic view of fibres, particles, and even molecular chemistry. This presents us with a wonderful opportunity. Firstly, to see the precise mechanics of the machine in front of us, and secondly, to understand how it has failed and, in turn, to use that information to inform present-day conservation practice. Working with historic manuscript material, the conservator spends a considerable portion of their working day examining the health of ink and pigments. These are just a few of the manuscripts that have passed through our lab in the last year or so. It's really no exaggeration to say there's something new on the bench every day. Often this media is stable and secure, firmly adhered to the page's surface, but on occasion, damage or deterioration warrant a closer look. In spite of the protection offered to closed pages within a binding, media may flake even, crack or powder, exhibiting signs of stress and aging, particularly as folia are flexed during use. Breakdown and damage to both pigments and binders can be caused by a number of factors, as I'm sure you're aware, including inappropriate bindings, poor handling, and unsuitable storage, as well as the natural aging of both the colorant and the binder. In order to ensure that a book or manuscript may be safely consulted by scholars, placed on display or digitized, conservation treatment may be required. Modern conservation approaches are minimally interventive, and invasive treatments are only carried out when natural aging, chemical deterioration, or mechanical wear have compromised an item's stability and long-term preservation. We adapt our treatments and recommendations according to the specific needs of an individual object in front of us, from a simple instruction on how best to handle a delicate Quran manuscript for digitization, to the comprehensive interventive repair of an aged and deteriorated binding structure. Whatever the treatment, or the specific object that requires our intervention, the conservator's approach is methodical and cautious. It begins with close observation of the artifact, an analysis of the physical remains in order to establish the causes of deterioration and to understand the requirements of the object that survives. Discussions with curators aid our understanding of the provenance of the item requiring work and offer both historical and contemporary context. Often, if a manuscript is in our lab, it is because one element or another has failed. This may be due to the natural aging of the materials from which it was made, fatigue from general use and opening for study, or caused by previous detrimental environmental conditions such as high humidity or fluctuating temperature. There are many causes to deterioration in books, and not all of them require consolidation or interventive repair. Similarly, there is no point conserving pigments if the conditions that caused or exacerbated the problems in the first place are not addressed. Whatever the case, in order to stabilize this physical, chemical, or biological deterioration, we first need to understand why it occurred. In these two objects that you see on the slide at the moment, on the left-hand side, is a really fascinating Indian book binding. It has lacquer covers, and the sewing that you can see revealed there is entirely original. So although the book wasn't functioning, we needed to be really careful to preserve all of those aspects. The Persian painting on the right of the screen shows different types of deterioration. So the marbled borders are in quite immaculate condition, but the figure painted over them is not doing so well. You can see that the white that is painted and the purple of his trousers, both are flaking away. There are quite extensive losses. And then there's really quite severe deterioration to his yellow robes. Pigments that are actively shearing, flaking, or powdering away from the support are likely to justify treatment, and a number of options can be considered once the causes of the deterioration have been ascertained. Flaking and powdering media is a damage common across many manuscript traditions due to the natural aging of binders, the inherent properties of the pigments in use, or damage from abrasion, water, or poor handling. Pigments may become friable. It may also be compounded by excessive burnishing or the use of too much binder, a hazard that historic treatises warn against. In the Canons of Painting, written between 1576 and 1602 by Sadiq Bek, a royal painter in Safavid, Iran, the author stresses the importance of the pigment to binder ratio and urges the reader to, and I quote, "Remember that while the amount of pigment is of no great matter, the proportion of the sweetener is subject to a definite rule. Too little relish and your colour paint will crumble like dry dust. Too much and it will flake up. This means that just the right proportion must be maintained," end quote. Although not explicitly stated, the pigment to binder ratio affected not only the artist's ability to apply the paint, but also the longevity of the painting on the page. Flaking is particularly associated with lead-containing pigments such as lead white, red lead, and mixtures such as pale flesh tones, which are inherently dense, heavy, and inclined to lose adhesion with the substrate, although it can occur in other pigments as well. It may be compounded by excessive burnishing or the use of too much binder, and exacerbated again by the movement of the folio in some instances. Flat sections of the painted surface may lift away from the substrate. They might be entirely detached and floating, lifting in only some areas, cupping, or completely separated from the surface of the object and losing all previous context on the page. During consolidation, under magnification, a wetting agent such as alcohol is applied at the fractures in the painted surface to prepare the object for the application of a consolidant. This is then applied soon after with an extremely fine brush and moves beneath the flakes of paint by capillary action, drawing them back down towards the substrate. In severe cases, such as the flaking of the elderly courtier's kurta in this Indian painting of Shah Jahan and an elderly courtier with a falcon, the consolidant can be assisted with the use of gentle pressure. We use small rectangles of felt covered with bondina, which is a non-woven polyester fabric, as drying cushions for both consolidation and repair. This was a really challenging treatment. It had been addressed by previous colleagues, and they had just seen that even the minute amount of surface tension of the adhesive that they applied, and the adhesive is only ever sort of 1 or 2% in concentration, was enough to fracture the flakes even further because they're so thin and so dense. So when I addressed this one under the microscope, I had an audience, which was not great, but it did work in the end. And we just had to really reduce the concentration of our adhesive. I keep talking about burnishing as well, and I realise that you may not all be familiar with this painting tradition, but in Islamic book painting, almost everything is really highly polished after it's applied, and this can give it a really beautiful luster and adds to the kind of effect of the image on the page, but it can also cause problems, as you see with this lead white. So I think that the degree of burnishing here had sort of compounded the problem of an inherently flaky pigment, and therefore this poor thing was just lifting away from the page. Powdering can also affect any pigment, as it's often the result of a weak or failed binder. This might be due to an inadequate binder to pigment ratio, as we have discussed, but can also be caused by a pigment that is coarsely ground or particularly heavy, such as azurite, which can be vulnerable to powdering, as it must only be coarsely ground to achieve a deep colour. Vermilion and red lead are also often affected by powdering, perhaps due to the use of egg yolk as a binder. Particles of powdering pigment appear matte and loose on the surface of the object. In these cases, there may be smudging, transfer to facing pages, or accumulation of pigment in the gutters of the book. For the consolidation of powdering media, a nebulizer is used to vaporize a very weak, as low as sort of 0.5% solution of the consolidant. This is evenly misted across the surface of the powdering pigment, which it permeates, drawing the loose particles of pigment down to the object surface and readhering them to the substrate. In extreme cases, such as the one you see on the slide in front of us, the consolidant required many applications before it was able to bind to the loose pigment and bring it back to the paper surface. It's a very painstaking process, and if you're doing it well, you shouldn't be able to see what you've done. So you have to have quite a strict process to make sure that you're covering everything evenly. However, in more typical treatments, such as the consolidation of this tie folding book, as few as 3 or 4 applications can be quite sufficient. We use 2 key materials for consolidation: isinglass for the stabilization of thick paint layers and media on parchment, and Bermacol E230FQ, an inert water-soluble ethyl hydroxyl ethyl cellulose on paper. Bermacol offers a matte consolidant which will not alter the colour or texture of paintings, even with repeated nebulizer applications. A like-with-like approach to consolidation has often been preferred. Protein-based consolidants, such as isinglass, are generally favoured for consolidation of pigments on parchment, and cellulose-based for consolidating pigments on paper. However, analytical studies have increasingly revealed that manuscript artists work selectively with their palette, choosing different binders for particular colours to give varied resulting textures to their paintings. And the panel on the left of the screen here, that sort of glossy black, that's a panel from a manuscript I'll mention a bit later, but I think you can see very, very clearly how they've done something quite deliberately to achieve this shine on the black panel. Pigments containing transition metals, such as ferrous iron or copper, present particular problems, causing oxidation of paper or parchment substrates. The use of localized water in repairs is therefore avoided as much as possible because it causes migration of any soluble metal ions and extends the potential for damage to surrounding areas. Aqueous phytate treatments may be suitable for the treatment of non-fugitive iron gall inks in disbound material, but recent research shows the use of remoistenable tissue, prepared once again with a proteinaceous adhesive, is often preferable for the repair of inks containing these damaging iron ions in situ. In the case of copper-based pigments, Dalmethacel A4M is a popular adhesive for repair. It is a film-forming methyl cellulose which is resistant to acid-catalyzed hydrolysis, the process by which verdigris, and I use verdigris in the loosest term, degrades. It can be used as a consolidant, but when prepared in solution with wheat starch paste, it makes a flexible and resistant repair paper of particular use for the repair of damaged frame lines that we see very commonly in Islamic manuscripts, and which need to flex when they're aligned with the gutter or spine edge of a manuscript. So here on the left, I'm sorry it's not higher resolution, you can see that these sort of ruled frame lines just totally drop out. And this is a very common problem with these manuscripts. And even though they may no longer appear green, we know that that is really a strong characteristic of the use of a copper containing pigment in these areas. And as you can see, the lovely orange, the red lead that they used, is completely unaffected and fine. We also get problems with the greens used in paintings, and that's what's happening with those poor little deer up in the corner, that the stripe from green used on the verso has really just damaged, darkened, and then eventually failed, causing the paper to fracture. It's almost like it's burnt. Remoistenable tissues provide a versatile and effective method for the repair of moisture-sensitive paper and pigments. Papers can be prepared in advance and stored to use as necessary. They are then cut to shape and activated in situ using the smallest and most controlled amount of moisture. Some types of degradation are left untreated in manuscript material, such as darkening and discoloration resulting from chemical interactions between orpiment and silver, or the blackening of lead white. Although disfiguring, this is often more of an aesthetic problem than one of ongoing deterioration. The damage is already done, and it can be harmful to try and reverse. So there are a number of reasons why it can be decided not to reverse this type of damage. Sometimes to do so, you actually have to remove a layer of the pigment from the surface, such as the silver, or as is the case with lead white, you end up chemically altering the materials. So if somebody were to carry out analysis in 100 years' time, they'd find something slightly different to the material that was originally applied by the artist. The trend for studies in manuscript materiality has grown noticeably over the past 2 decades, and the opportunity for conservators to contribute to the fields of art history, manuscript studies, and material science, due to their intimate proximity to the manuscripts in their care, is increasingly recognised. The ability to identify the pigments and binding media used in book illustration provides a powerful tool to further categorise artworks and to complement stylistic analyses. It can also inform conservation, both our choice of sympathetic materials during treatment and our understanding of the mechanisms of decay at work in each object we approach, as well as contributing to our understanding of historic manuscript material technology. Unlike European illuminated manuscripts, which have been the subject of wide-ranging and extensive analytical examinations for quite some time, the materials of manuscripts from the Islamic world are only just beginning to be understood in detail. 2 significant case studies in my current workplace highlight the great potential of pigment analysis in increasing our understanding of historic objects. In late 2013 and early 2014, 2 rounds of non-invasive scientific analysis helped to identify the materials used in the palette of the Ruzbehan Quran. The Chester Beatty's Ruzbehan manuscript is arguably one of the most beautiful examples of 16th century manuscript painting in the world. It was produced around 1550 in Shiraz, in southwestern Iran, and was created by the eponymous Ruzbehan and a team of illuminators. Only 5 Qurans signed by Ruzbehan are known to have survived, and the Chester Beatty example is renowned amongst them for its particular quality. Following a peer-reviewed application process, we worked with MoLab, an EU-funded mobile analytical laboratory. That is them arriving with their heavily laden truck of analytical equipment. The advantages of collaboration with the MoLab team are pretty obvious. Firstly, they provide mobile equipment, avoiding the risk and costs associated with the transportation of valuable art objects. Secondly, they provide incredible expertise. The specialist scientific team travels with the equipment, both to operate their machinery and interpret the data it produces. Furthermore, The techniques they use carry out imaging and analytical measurements in situ, that is, non-invasively, without taking samples, without contact with the object's surface or damaging the object in any way. Finally, access to MoLab is free, thanks to their peer-reviewed application process. The project Park hoped to increase our knowledge of mid-16th century Shirazi artists, materials and techniques, and contribute to a fuller understanding of the working methodologies of Islamic book artists. Having a well-considered and informed reason for analysis is, in my opinion, critical before undertaking any work. What is your question? And what is your reason for undertaking analysis? In this case, our desire to better understand the object in front of us was complemented by a unique opportunity to safely access each folio individually for in-depth study. Similarly, there was no comparanda, there was no equivalent project which had been carried out so far, so this was a unique opportunity. Conservation of the severely deteriorated copper-containing ruled frame lines had necessitated the disbinding of the manuscript, making the pages fully and safely accessible. 13 folios from the Quran were analysed using non-invasive and non-destructive techniques. Although not all of the pigments in the Ruzbehan Quran could be analysed, generally due to the minute surface areas that they tended to cover, the results obtained through the analysis of 13 folios have revealed a comprehensive picture of the materials used in this manuscript. In general, these pigments seem to be in keeping with those identified in the few previous analytical studies of contemporary manuscripts and with the accounts given in historic treatises, such as the canons of painting that I mentioned earlier. A core group of inorganic colours were found to have been used throughout the manuscript, including the synthetic colours red lead, lead white, vermilion, and lamp black, as well as the naturally occurring mineral colours orpiment yellow, brown earth, copper-containing green atacamite, and ultramarine from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli. These were complemented by the virtuoso use of a small number of organic colorants. Both lac and safflower were conclusively identified and have been used to create a huge variety of tones throughout the manuscript. This red panel that you see in the top left, this was the panel where we finally conclusively found lac. We suspected it was there, but organics are notoriously difficult to pin down. And this panel was the one that had sufficient density and sufficient surface area to finally reveal that it was on the page. Similarly, the small peach panel on the right of the screen is safflower. And another reason that we know it's safflower is that in this case it's used as a dye. So that small panel has actually been dyed separately, the paper prepared, cut out and then applied. And this was done systematically through the manuscript. So it was totally a part of the overall original scheme for the manuscript. But it's incredible to see the levels of technique and technical ability that were applied just on one page. The selective use of a range of binding materials has allowed the artist to achieve a wide variety of tones and effects, as well as the gum binders typically identified in Islamic manuscript painting. The use of a glossy lipidic binder derived from a drying seed oil was identified for the first time, completely rewriting the widely accepted understanding of this manuscript tradition. The artist's skillful and nuanced use of this material has added a unique texture and finish to his repertoire, adding to the overall visual effect of the manuscript. I really feel the more that I look at this Quran, it was an exercise in brilliance. It seems to have been so many different things which would have been available to any artist, but he's used them in a different way, almost to sort of signal just how accomplished he was. The second project took place in 2018. And it was again driven by the pressing need to carry out conservation, in this case, to a large early Quran manuscript on parchment. This time, EQUIP, Early Quran Illumination on Parchment, they love an acronym, focused on the material analysis of Chester Beatty 1404. It's a large 201 folio Quran, actually representing only about 56% of the original manuscript, but it was probably made in Yemen and it dates to the early 8th century. It had suffered extensive water damage and subsequent corrosion of the iron-containing ink it was written with. It was in turn subject to numerous layers of previous repairs, many of which are now failing, ineffective, and incurring damage to the manuscript, leaving it too fragile for study or display. Questions for the MoLab initiative were formulated in advance of a week-long visit, in light of current research in the field of both Islamic manuscript studies and parchment materiality. Our key objectives were to identify the materials used in the illumination of this 8th century Quran and to characterize the parchment of the manuscript, in particular, to identify any surface preparation materials or techniques in evidence. 34 folios, each with these decorative illuminated bands, were examined using a range of complementary analytical techniques within 3 dedicated spaces at the Chester Beatty. The analysis was supervised by members of our EQUIP team and facilitated using a variety of flexible conservation mounting techniques, thank goodness for magnets is what I should probably say, to enable full access to the manuscript folios. As the new XRF mapping technique was the most time-consuming machine in use, it was used to establish a timeline for the rotation of the folios between the teams and analytical techniques. It also drove the decision to prioritise the folios and narrowed down the selection from 34 to just 15 folios. Again, the palette appeared to be quite restrained and rather homogeneous. It does not include any organic colorants, but instead sticks to a small number of unadulterated inorganic colours. These include red lead, often characterised by a dark layer of discoloration, and the red mineral cinnabar, a mercuric sulfide, identified in the diacritical marks and red text annotations throughout the manuscript. All blue areas were painted with natural ultramarine, distinct due to the presence of sulfur and potassium with XRF, and the low levels of fluorescence in UV visible spectroscopy. A small amount of carbon-based black, visible with hyperspectral imaging, has been used in the outlines and drawings for the decorative bands. Green areas were characterised by copper, but on several folios, this was also found with gypsum. The use of orpiment characterises all areas of yellow in the manuscript. The gold is particularly interesting. Originally applied as leaf, it now appears cracked and almost granular. XRF analysis found that it was almost always associated with arsenic, likely the signature of orpiment used to extend this precious metal. The ink is consistently galotanic. Of perhaps greater interest than the mineral pigments is the variety of binders that have been used with them. A gum appears to have been used in areas of blue and red pigment as a binder, whilst a proteinaceous binding material has been identified in areas of gold. Metal oxalates, common degradation products of organic materials, were also found across the entire surface of the folios. In particular, the widespread presence of calcium oxalate across the folios tentatively suggests the degradation of an organic plant-based parchment surface treatment used across the surface of the folios. This is an important matter, as it may suggest that the cellulosic surface sizes that are so characteristic of paper objects prepared in the Islamic world were in fact drawn from a much earlier parchment preparation tradition. Or perhaps these oxalates are evidence of the date-based parchment preparation said to have been used in Kufa in Iraq to ensure that skins remained flexible, and mentioned by Ibn al-Nadim in his 10th century survey of Muslim culture, Kitab al-Firist. So I hope I've explained how and why the Conservator is interested in pigments and media, but I haven't actually spoken about any practical experimentation. For me, the opportunity to make colours and dyes using traditional techniques and then paint with them is directly relevant to my understanding of historic manuscript materials and items undergoing treatment. I want to understand how each material behaves, and then with the understanding that I hope I'll learn how it behaves in historic manuscripts. Is a colour easy or difficult to work with? Does it prefer one binder to another or need a specific binder to give it lustre? I've always been a bit more interested in the painter's supply cupboard than the finished artefact. It is the process of making an object that I find truly compelling and so informative to conservation. This fascination with production means my kitchen's always full of a few jars and bottles of inedible preserves, but I hope that many of you will understand this compulsion. In early 2000, when photographs were still on film, and when I was a student at Camberwell College of Art, a visitor to our studio came in to tell us about the Montefiascone project. She said she would be teaching a class on the medieval palette in which participants would hear lectures on the history of materials and techniques before having the chance to experiment with their production. The class would be held in a medieval hilltop town in Lazio, Italy. I knew I had to be there. The course was taught by Cheryl Porter, director of the project, a conservator and expert in manuscript media. It is no exaggeration to say that that week I spent attending Cheryl's course in August 2000 was utterly formative for me. Cheryl's generosity with knowledge and practical approach to learning repositions the arts and sciences, returning both to their practical origins. In that class, I came to understand that nothing happens by accident. Artists made deliberate choices with their materials and used their understanding of chemical processes, perhaps just through their observation of materials over time, to inform their daily practice. It remains an approach which is useful to me in the lab every day. My own experimentations with manuscript materials have followed these principles of functionality first. I have collected unripe buckthorn berries to produce a dye for alum-toured bookbinding skins, and then, later in the year, tried to preserve the sticky, ripe berries for their sap green colour. Sap green is fugitive and messy, but the colour is vivid and easy to use. It doesn't keep well, again underlining the sort of historic suggestion that it was a local and seasonal colour only. The unripe berries, which produce that really just, I think, perfect lemony yellow, are super easy to use. They can be kept all year round. And again, this ties into what we know about the medieval library actually being a really vibrant and colourful place. Grinding down chunks of lapis lazuli, removing inclusions, and painting with the resulting pigment ultramarine gives one an understanding of how challenging it can be to work with. It was the most valuable and sought after colour, certainly in the 15th and 16th centuries, but it can be temperamental and changeable. Binders alter the colour, it is almost impossible to paint over, and it clings to the brush like sand and cannot be burnished. This explains why, when you see it in manuscripts on the page, it has this real three-dimensionality. So I think you can see with the raking light on the left just how thick the lapis is. And that's because you can't polish it, you can't compress it. If you do, it begins to blacken and fall away from the page. My next experiment is due to be with safflower, the source of a spectrum of pinks, peaches and yellows identified in the Ruzbehan Quran. It is notoriously difficult to extract the rich red it was valued for, but I want to try dyeing papers with the paler colours first. Cheryl has warned me against it. She says it's time consuming and difficult, but I am feeling bolstered by the discovery of a bunch of fresh safflower that I bought in Marks and Spencer's, as well as Jumana Mejdi's recent work to understand the practicalities of this dye in light of recipes from historic treatises. We will see. Decoding historic recipes and linking them with physical objects is not always neat, but by making reconstructions using the information gathered from fragmentary manuscript evidence, the conservator can contribute to our understanding of the materiality of these objects. Rather than reading the text of the manuscript, I like to think we read the materials. Paint and dye making is a tool which continues to add to our understanding. The importance of collaboration with our peers internationally has also become a really important factor when making decisions about conservation treatments and interventions. It informs the individual conservator and allows them to offer guidance as to the best and most culturally sympathetic treatments they can offer a manuscript, no matter where in the world it's kept today. At the Chester Beatty, we work hard to keep up with current research and developments in the field of conservation that we can consider for use in the care of the collections. We strive to learn from the misunderstandings, unsympathetic and incompatible treatments of the past and provide the very best solutions for the manuscripts we care for today. The use of high quality, tried and tested materials such as beautiful handmade Japanese papers, pure adhesives and inert storage materials allow us to be hopeful that our interventions will serve the collection well and can be easily reversed in the future should better solutions become available. Conversations between conservators, makers, scientists and historians over tea, coffee and cake, or if necessary, email, offer a bridge between our disciplines and ensure that the care of our cultural heritage is shared. It stands to reason that if we wish to learn more about the complexities of manuscript construction and ensure the long-term preservation of manuscript materials, we must develop a more complete understanding of the many aspects of their production, as well as their intrinsic cultural value. Only then will it be possible to ensure the sensitive preservation of binding structures and that of the delicate and always unique manuscripts they contain. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristine. That was one of the most beautiful presentations I have seen. Just being able to see that the intensity of the colors and the care and detail in each of these images is astounding. And, you know, when you stop and think that these were done, you know, some of these were almost 1,000 years ago, without electric light and, you know, machine-made paintbrushes and whatever. It always blows my mind to see these ancient pieces so well done. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Kristine? Sarah?
Oh, hi. Yeah, thank you, Kristine. That was just so lovely. I just have two questions and they're quite quick. First of all, you said that the pigments were burnished, the Islamic pigments were burnished. Do you know what they were burnished with? Do you know what tools they used?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a living tradition, very much so. So you can still find evidence of this, but agate seems to be the most popular tool. Mm-hmm. But also glass or other kind of smooth stones were used too. I would say agate was the go-to.
Right. Okay, lovely, thank you. And my second question was, I was thinking about when I saw the corrosive properties of verdigris and copper-based pigments. Is there a difference between parchment and paper in how corrosive those pigments can be?
I would say it's less about the substrate and more about the recipe of the green that they're using. So something that I didn't go into today, but has been found through analysis by Mandana Barkeshli, an Iranian conservator, is that in Persian manuscripts, they knew that verdigris was causing problems. Well, we know that Cennini knew this too, but they added saffron to their greens, and saffron acts as a buffer. It creates this beautiful pistachio green as it's described in the treaties and recipes, but it also buffers the deterioration. So in manuscripts where you find saffron in with the copper containing green, you don't get the deterioration. and then it seems to be luck of the draw. If somebody was not in a rush maybe and used a bit less acid in their recipe, it seems to still be stable on the page. But maybe I often think that somebody was just totally in a rush, and therefore they bumped up all their proportions, and now the copper's eaten through the page. In the Ruzbehan, we saw that it was only the ruled frame lines where the green was deteriorating, and other areas of green were in much better condition. We didn't find saffron, but it is incredibly difficult to find non-destructively. So I wonder if it's there.
Lovely, thank you. That's so interesting.
You're welcome.
Actually, anybody else have a question?
I was just curious as to whether they were really specific pigments in Islamic manuscript as opposed to European ones, or because these seem to be pretty much the ones you mentioned anyway, seem to be pretty much also used in all the European manuscripts. Is there any, and I was also a bit curious about red lead versus vermilion, were they both used as extensively one as the other? Because they always say that it was an Arabic invention, synthetic vermilion. And so I was wondering whether that implied that Islamic manuscript used a lot more of that than red lead, perhaps, because they're quite similar in color.
Yeah, they're really, really good questions. I would say that it's just the way that the pigments were used that was different, and perhaps the abundance of certain pigments. So obviously geographically, if you are in the Islamic world, particularly if you're in Iran, then you are much closer to the source of ultramarine, and the abundance of ultramarine that you see in these manuscripts, it's dripping off the page. And I think that's something that you see in these manuscripts that you don't always see in European manuscripts. But no, I think that the actual colours tend to be remarkably consistent. I know there will inevitably always be a few exceptions.
And can I just ask one more question about ultramarine precisely? Because you seem to say earlier on that they just ground it like a pigment, when what I know of it is it's actually quite a huge process, and it's not at all grinding. It is actually all that extracting through resin and all of that. So would they have used it as just a ground pigment? So
I think that ultramarine is utterly fascinating, and we could spend a week talking just about that colour, minimum. But I think there are different leanings, and there are different findings. So again, in the Ruzbehan Quran, we found this really dark kind of heart of the flame blue colour, used pure and unadulterated. But we also found slightly paler blues mixed with lead white, and we also found really greyish blues which had not that much lead white in them and a lot of ultramarine. But I think that shows that you've got different types of processing. So yes, there's absolutely the like really extensive version of the Cennini again, and doing various things using soaps to try and extract just the lazurite. But if you had access to more of the stone, you could be much more picky about which bits of stone you chose to grind up and which bits of stone you chose to use. So I think there's two things going on. I think there's processing of an impure lapis lazuli stone, and there's also selective use of different grades of lapis stone as well.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem.
Elizabeth?
Hello, Kristine, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. I was wondering about sort of like what span of time do you really, of Islamic manuscript painting, do you really kind of focus on? And from whatever that span of time is, I was wondering if there are certain like traditions of certain pigments being used during certain eras and then changing. So if you could just, pigments in manuscripts over time is the question.
Absolutely. I would love to say that it was down to one particular decade or even century, but I think we're still really in the early days. So we're still trying to understand what's going on. I know I have colleagues who are working, say, on Qajar manuscripts, which are sort of 1800s Iran, colleagues working on high Ottoman manuscripts from the 17th century, say. But as yet, we just don't have enough data to be able to start pinning down what was happening when. One of the reasons that I was really interested to be able to do the analysis on that amazing 8th century Quran is because that's the earliest manuscript illustration that we see in the Islamic world. And I'm very curious about where it comes from. Like, is it an entirely isolated occurrence, and that strikes me as highly unlikely, or is it being influenced by the way that pigments were used, say, in the Coptic tradition or in the Ethiopian tradition? Where is it coming from? Again, we don't know yet, but we can say that we're seeing exactly the same pigments that we see in Coptic manuscripts of the 8th century and so on. So I think there's just a lot more work to be done before we really know.
Thank you so much.
Ruth?
Hi, yeah, it was a really interesting presentation. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is, I wondered if there were any texts, like say the Cennini text, about this kind of manuscript, you know, Islamic manuscripts. Do they have their own writers?
They do, absolutely. So the earliest is a treatise written for a ruler in North Africa, I think in the 13th century. I'm going to get that slightly wrong, I'm sure. But then there are various reworkings of that treatise, and they're kind of book arts treatises. So they tend to be looking at everything from your ink recipes right through to your binding and the whole process. Yeah, they're really interesting. They talk about the tools and the best papers that you should use, because obviously in the Islamic world, they're using paper from definitely from the 11th century and probably a bit earlier. So much before it got to Europe. There's Sadiki Bek, who's the go-to one for Safavid painting. And then there are later calligraphic treatises in particular. So because the arts of the book were so completely revered in the Islamic world, the calligrapher and the book artist was revered also. So they had a very high position in society. And I sometimes think, again, and maybe there's a hint, the sort of pinch of salt that you need to take with Cennini, the same applies. But there's a lot of prestige to be gained in writing a treatise. So that there's probably 5 that I can think of, but probably many more later.
Oh, that's really interesting. And the other thing I wondered about was about the significance of the colours, you know, the meaning behind them, like the blue or the yellows or... Yeah,
so again, I don't think that's really been explored in full. We know that they're prioritising high value pigments in terms of gold and lapis, but not only, because we get, say, a very cheap colour like safflower being used in a really high status manuscript. So again, I think it's, as is ever the case, more questions than answers.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
During these periods, are you seeing any parallels between the materials used and, say, the pigments and the binders and the techniques from east to west? So say, you know, let's say from 1300 to 1400, just for an example, are there parallels between the two?
I think there really are, and I think that the selective binders is definitely a particular area for that. So we know that in those European illuminated manuscripts, we know that artists were using tempera in some instances in their manuscripts. But quite often the Islamic tradition in the West has been kind of just pushed to one side and kind of given a catch-all statement, whether it's about the bindings being weak or whether it's about them only using gum arabic. And increasingly, because there is now analysis and lots of close looking happening, we're able to say no, that of course it's much more nuanced. But the parallels, I think, will be recognized increasingly. The binders is the obvious one that jumps to mind for me.
And why does binders seem to stick out to you?
Because I think that it's been a sort of sweeping generalization that, again, the way that we've thought that book artists worked, saying, oh, well, if they're working on paper, they're going to use gum. But to see that actually it is just much more down to individual choice and recognizing their understanding of the materials that they're using as well. The gum arabic is great, but if you add too much to get a shine, then it's just going to flake away from the page. So actually it makes more sense to introduce a lipid and so on.
I think it's really interesting that we have this tendency to think of time as kind of a finite thing, and knowledge, you know, this knowledge about this binder just, you know, popped into being, say, in the 2nd century.
Yes.
But in my work, I've discovered that this is knowledge that goes back so far, we can't identify when it started, and we're starting to be able to see how it moved across the earth, you know, as people migrated and stuff. And I think it's really interesting to look at, you know, how something in the East is going on at the same time as something in the West.
Yeah.
And what is that connection? Are they connected, or are they two isolated occurrences? I think that's just one of my little pet kind of things.
It's super interesting.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, sorry, I have one more. The conversation about binders reminded me of my other question. Yeah, I think about that stuff all the time. Like, yeah, when things come up in multiple cultures or, you know, in multiple places, disparate. I was wondering, you described the lipid, it was like a lipid binder that gave it the gloss. And I think you said it was like oil pressed from a seed. Do you think it's linseed oil, or do you know what kind of oil it is? And did it affect the paper? Did the acids affect the paper?
Yes. So the other really interesting thing about that manuscript in particular, as I mentioned, the safflower panels were prepared separately and then stuck in, because to use safflower in that way, you're using it as a dye. So you're putting the paper into a dye bath. Similarly, with the panels which use this kind of lipidic oil binder, I do think it's a sort of drying seed oils like linseed, but we don't know specifically which one it is. But again, that was a panel that was prepared separately and then stuck in. Obviously, if you put paint with an oil containing pigment in directly onto the paper of a page, it's going to leach out and cause all sorts of problems. And they clearly recognized this because that panel was prepared separately, allowed to dry, and then put into the manuscript. So really conscious decisions.
Thank you.
Welcome.
We have a few things in the chat. It says, hi from Belgium, Saturday evening in my couch. That's from Evie. And then Una, fantastic that you can work with old recipes in your own kitchen. We all work with old recipes in our kitchens, don't we?
I hope so. I hope I've found other people who understand it.
Well, I know an awful lot of people who have, there's a section for cooking food, and then there's a section and tools and materials for making art materials.
Exactly.
Let's see, there's Angelina says, thank you so much. So fascinating. What a sacred craft. Okay. I don't know why, but my screen just changed.
That was me. I stopped the screen share. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Nassim says, thank you very much, Kristine. Was a fantastic presentation. Amna says, hello from Pakistan. Love the talk today. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering, what is your current favorite, or the thing that you're most excited about, or like maybe mystery that you're kind of stumped on, and yeah.
Oh, that's a really tough question. I inevitably am most fascinated by whatever I'm looking at that moment, but I think the one that has really kind of wedged in and stayed with me is this idea that there could be some kind of surface preparation on the parchment in these early manuscripts. I think that there is. I really think that there is, and I've had various conversations with, biologists and parchment specialists, because absolutely, as a conservator, I'm trying to recognize my own limits. I need the collaboration of expertise from other fields. But at the moment, it really does look like there is a very deliberate layer applied to the parchment, exactly as we see in later paper manuscripts. So I find that really fascinating. Why are they doing it? Are they doing it consistently? Is it happening in every manuscript in this period? And what does it bring to the object, other than like making it appear nice? Does it do something else? Because in the later paper manuscripts, it's very clear that if you add a surface size and then you polish the paper, your pen just glides across it. And that was a really desirable characteristic. So when you're writing with a reed pen. So I'm wondering, in the parchment tradition, what the original motivation for doing this was, whether maybe it was the same. We just don't know yet.
Marina, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. It was an incredibly fascinating and informative discussion for me. So thank you so much, Kristine. So my question specifically is regarding the gold that you see in Islamic manuscripts. So I do study manuscript illumination, and I know when I have viewed on occasion digitized manuscript that perhaps has suffered from water damage, generally the first thing to go is the lapis lazuli. It just washes away. And then any other mineral-based pigment that's mixed with gum arabic typically washes away. Yeah. But often the gold remains. So this makes me question, is it possible that it was mixed with a different medium than the mineral-based pigments? And have you found any evidence of this?
Well, yes, absolutely. I completely agree. I think the gold is treated very differently. I think the gold does change with time as well. So we know that shell gold is used pretty early in the Islamic world, certainly by the 13th century. But if you're using shell gold, probably the binder is gum by that time. But still, it would often have been applied first so that you can burnish it, so that you can really sort of compact it on the surface and give it that luster. But in the earlier manuscripts, the Umayyad one that I showed you, it's applied as leaf. And it's definitely applied with a proteinaceous binder. So I think there are different phases of use of gold and different ways that the gold was used. Cheryl Porter's been doing some really interesting work on metals in Islamic manuscripts, and I think that she had an article published just last year. So that would definitely be worth looking at if you're interested in it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got a question. It looked like particularly in the one manuscript where we looked at it, raking, it looked like the ultramarine really was not ground very finely.
Yeah.
So is like azurite, when you don't want to grind azurite too fine, otherwise you lose your color. That material is all about refraction. Is that the same with ultramarine? Do you lose color the more you grind it, or is there a reason for it being left fairly coarse?
I don't think that you lose color grinding it extra fine. It's more the impurities and such that contribute to the color. But the particle shape is peculiar. So again, I was looking into this in terms of why it seems to abrade when it faces itself across an opening. So if you have lapis on opposite sides of the page and they touch, it becomes black. And the particle shape, the way I can explain it, so I was going to the pigment compendium to think about particle sizes and shapes and so on, was that it's like flint. So it's very sharp particles and kind of smooth, but with sharp facets. So that's why it sticks to your brush. That's why it can be a challenge to grind. And that's why it seems to not do well with any burnishing. So I think it's various factors, but not in exactly the same way as with azurite.
Okay. This is another thing that always intrigues me, as the individual characteristics of each pigment.
Yes.
And how they want to be treated, and what is going to be best in this application. And it's really interesting to go back into these old manuscripts and look at how things were done and try to get inside the head of the person who did it. Why did he do it this way? Was there a reason, or was that just what he felt like throwing on the page at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I think again with ultramarine, in a lot of these really complex Islamic frontispieces or so on, where the detail is really fine, I find it completely unbelievable, but the lapis was always applied last. So they paint all this incredibly fine, intricate detail. So the gold is burnished, the colors are put down, everything is on, and then they go in back around with this ultramarine, which again adds to this kind of pillowy three-dimensional look. But that's because, again, as we were explaining, the particles won't tolerate being burnished. Similarly, with painting on top of ultramarine, you don't see it very often, and if you do see it, it tends to have problems. But there are some. Well, in the Rizbehan, again, as I said, I think he was effectively showing off. So he knew how to do it. And whether he was putting down layers before or what, he was doing something which enabled this kind of painting over ultramarine in a few examples, in a few cases. But then it's about material choice. So, of course, painting on gold is never a great idea. But if you use lac, or if you use safflower, which is going to be a bit sticky and almost resinous, then fine, you can do it. You can find a way. So, yeah, I think it's very, very interesting the way that they use different materials as well.
So was there a rationale for applying the ultramarine last?
It's so that you can polish all the other colors and make sure they're all pristine.
Okay.
You don't ever have to paint over it.
That makes sense. Okay. Marina, do you have another question? Oh, okay. Anybody else? You can just speak up if you want. Let's see. Nancy P says, thank you for your wonderful detailed presentation. Looking forward to seeing the Chester Beatty manuscripts in a new light on my next visit. I'm in Dublin too.
Oh, very nice. Good. Well,
lucky you, Nancy.
Well, if any of you find yourself in Dublin, do come and say hello, please.
Mashid says, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge. It was fantastic.
We have a very kind audience.
Pigment people seem to be that way. We just, this is so important to all of us. And every little bit of knowledge that we can glean from wherever is valuable. Elizabeth, do you have another question? Oh, okay. Anybody else?
Laughing at your comment about how pigment people are curious and stuff.
A little obsessive.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's all fine.
Yeah, where the obsession is good. It's a healthy obsession. Don't ever let anybody convince you otherwise. Well, I want to thank everybody. This has been a wonderful presentation. It's given me a lot to think about. I can see parallels in what Kristine does with some of the work I do and the types of research I'm doing. And I hope that this has expanded everybody's minds about the use of materials and how they each have their own characteristics and behaviors and how they each want to be little divas in their own ways. And for us to be able to respect that, to be able to use them properly. I'm going to let everybody run away now to finish the rest of your day or evening and whatever. And I just want to thank you, Kristine, again. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much. I have got to come see the Chester Beatty now.
You really do.
And I will definitely. For those of you in the US or traveling to the US, there are a number of good manuscript collections in the country. I know that in Oregon, at Oregon State University, for one, they have a very nice collection of just mind-blowing manuscripts. But I would encourage you, whenever you visit a city or, even in your own hometown, look and see if your local library or your museum has objects like this that you can go and view. Every good museum or library should make these things available for viewing. You probably have to ask by special request, but it's well worth it.